Hello students, welcome back to another interesting session with me Kiran Chaudhary, your biology faculty at Infinity Learn by Shri Chaitanya. आज हम पढ़ने वाले हैं students pollen grains के बारे में, right? Let's start. So आप इस board पे जो देख सकते हैं is what? It's a beautiful flower. See this? Beautiful flower, and if you notice carefully, what is this? This yellow portion which is like a dust on the beautiful petals of this flower is pollen grain, a dust of pollen grains. Yes, so this is the topic of today's session. आज हमें pollen grains के बारे में पढ़ना है. It's going to be super interesting. Stay connected. So see here what I have to show you on the next slide. See students, pollen grains actually represent male gametophytic generation. What do I mean by that? Let us break these two words, male gametophyte, right? So I'll start with the gametophyte word. What is a gametophyte? Gametophyte is a plant body on which gametes will be produced, and when I say it is a male gametophyte, that means on that plant body what will be formed? Male gametes will be formed. So this very first line that pollen grain represent male gametophyte means inside pollen grain at certain stage male gamete or formation of male gamete will take place. So that is what this first line wants to convey, right? Now the second point. Second point is students, if we talk about the shape and the size of pollen grains are generally spherical in shape and 25 to 50 micrometer in diameter. And see here with this beautiful image you can see how in an electron microscope or under an electron microscope pollen grains look like. Very important facts, represent male gametophytic generation, and they are, if we talk about the size students, what is the size? 25 to 50 micrometer. I need to take the pen. Okay, so here it goes. Next, so this is the important lines that you need to remember, the facts. Now next what I want to explain is, see, on this slide we will discuss about the structure of pollen grain. See here, with this representative diagram I will show you what a pollen grain look like, right? So see here students, this is the pollen wall, the outer. If I talk about the pollen wall students, what is pollen wall? It is covering the constituents, the inner parts of the pollen grain. So the pollen wall actually made up of two layers, the outermost and the inner one. The outermost is known as exine and the inner one is known as intine. So exine and intine will together form what? Wall of pollen grain, right? Now what is this? This is the cytoplasm inside of the pollen grain. What is this? This is nucleus of the pollen grain. And other than that, there is one important thing that I want all of you to note is there are these pore-like structures. See here, these pore-like structures known as germ pore. Okay, so this is how a pollen grain look like, or a structure of pollen grain look like. Now I will take this intine and exine. I will do a little discussion on these two parts, and then I will come back to what germ pore is and what is the function of germ pore. So till then just give me few minutes, I will definitely get back to germ pore, but before that I need to discuss about exine and intine, right? So see here students, what is exine? Exine is actually the outermost. Exine is actually the outermost layer of the pollen wall. Outermost, and this is the inner one. Now see students, this exine is made up of a material known as Sporopollenin. What? Sporopollenin. And this intine is made up of what? Intine is made up of pectin. It is made up of pectin and cellulose, also known as pectocellulose. Right? So, see here students, exine is the outer layer, intine is inner to exine. Exine is made up of sporopollenin, intine is made up of pectin and cellulose. Intine is elastic. Intine is elastic. But when we talk about sporopollenin, with which the exine layer is formed, see students, when we talk about sporopollenin, there is a fact about it that you need to understand. Sporopollenin is actually one of the most hardest or resistant organic material known or present on earth. And what do I mean when I say it is the most resistant organic material? Listen very carefully. What exactly makes it a resistant organic material? So, see students, if we talk about the properties of sporopollenin, the chemical one, so sporopollenin actually can withstand high temperature, strong alkali as well as acidic environment. Yes, and till date there is no enzyme discovered that can degrade sporopollenin, hence making sporopollenin one of the most resistant organic material. And yes, you are thinking in the right direction, because of the presence of sporopollenin on the pollen grain, the pollen grains can be preserved for several years as fossils. So, preservation of pollen grains as fossils is possible because of this sporopollenin. Very, very important. Now, I hope you all understood that. One more thing is that the intine, if I talk about the intine is actually continuous, right? It is present in continuous form covering the pollen grain, right? But when we talk about exine is discontinuous. It is not continuously present on the or continuously present over the pollen grain, right? So, the places where sporopollenin is absent in exine, right? The places where sporopollenin is absent in exine are known as germ pore. Yes. And what is the function of germ pore? See students, you all know, right? So, what is the function of pollen grain? Pollen grain, when the anther will mature, undergo dehiscence, pollen grain will come out via certain or like any biotic or abiotic pollinating agent. They will ultimately reach to the stigma where pollen grain needs to germinate. So, during the germination of pollen grain, what will happen? The intine layer actually comes out through this germ pore to form a pollen tube, like in the style of that pistil of the female part, right? I hope this much is clear that what is a germ pore and what is the function, right? So, let us come back to this discussion where I was talking about the structure of pollen grain. Let me give you a quick recap of whatever I taught you right now. Is the pollen grain look like this. It has a pollen wall surrounding it made up of outer exine and inner intine layer, and exine is actually made up of sporopollenin, and the places where sporopollenin is absent is known as germ pore. Intine is the inner layer made up of pectin and cellulose. It is continuous and elastic in nature. I hope this much is clear, right? Now, what I have to discuss next? Next is formation of a mature pollen grain, right? So, see here students, what is this? This is a pollen grain. This is a pollen grain, and not to forget pollen grains are actually haploid. Why pollen grains are haploid, students? For all those who are still thinking how ma'am is saying that pollen grain are haploid, I request all of you to go and check my previous video just previous to this, where I explained about stamen, right, and microsporangium, and in that, in the end, I also did a discussion on microsporogenesis, where I explained how from a microspore mother cell, microspores will be produced and these microspores ultimately lead to the formation of pollen grains. And not to forget, microspore mother cells are diploid cells. Microspore mother cell undergoes meiosis to form haploid microspores, and haploid microspores do formation of pollen grains, and hence pollen grains are haploid. So, this recap was for all those who missed that lecture, right, and in more detail if you want to study, do visit the previous lecture. Now, this is the pollen grain, and the objective of this slide is to understand how a mature pollen grain will be produced. See very carefully. So, this mature pollen grain or the nucleus of this, so the nucleus of this pollen grain, the objective is to understand the formation of mature pollen grain, and here is the pollen grain with which I need to start my discussion. This is not the mature one, this is the immature one, right, and here is the mature pollen grain. Let me write it for you. This is what? This is mature pollen grain. So, this whole formation starts with this immature pollen grain, and what will happen? The nucleus of this pollen grain, the haploid nucleus of this pollen grain will undergo division, right, will undergo division, and after certain changes, after certain stages will divide into two nucleus, and then will form or will undergo cytokinesis and ultimately result into this structure. What you can see here is single cell, single nucleus, and what you can see here is inside a pollen grain, two cells and two nucleus, right. So, this is from this stage to this stage after division, ultimately what you get is a mature pollen grain. So, now let us see what all are present inside a mature pollen grain. So, in next few minutes I will discuss the structure of a mature pollen grain. See here. So, a mature pollen grain looks like this, where it has one vegetative cell and another one is the generative cell. Let us discuss the characteristics of a vegetative cell and generative cell of pollen grain. See here. If I talk about the vegetative cell, students, vegetative cell is the largest cell and it is the small, right. So, generative cell is actually the small cell, vegetative cell is the large cell, right. Now, vegetative cell actually has abundant reserve food stored in its cytoplasm, right. If I talk about the nucleus of the vegetative cell is what, students? The nucleus of the vegetative cell is irregular shape. It possesses irregular shaped nucleus. Now, let us see characteristics of this vegetative cell. Now let us see the characteristics of generative cell. So, generative cell is actually small, first of all, right. Secondly, what you need to understand is generative cell floats in the cytoplasm of vegetative cell, right. next point that you need to understand here is, students, that the generative cell itself is spindle shaped. It is spindle shaped. The cell itself is in spindle shape. Next is, the cytoplasm of the generative cell is dense, right. So, these are the some characteristics that you need to understand about vegetative cell and generative cell. Let me give you a brief recap of that. Vegetative cell is the large cell, generative cell is the small cell. Vegetative cell has abundant reserve food material present in its cytoplasm and its nucleus is irregularly shaped. Generative cell is small in shape, it floats in the cytoplasm of the vegetative cell and it is spindle in shape, the cell itself. Now, also remember that the cytoplasm of the generative cell is dense. This is what this is. On this I explained to you the formation of a mature pollen grain. So, here we are with the mature pollen grains and these are the two types of cells present in a mature pollen grain. So, when a pollen grain reached to this stage, we can call it is a mature pollen grain. So, now students, see here, when a pollen grain has become mature, that means this is the time for anther to undergo dehiscence and release this mature pollen grain into the environment so that these pollen grains can easily be carried via different or various available pollinating agent to stigma, right, of a flower where they need to germinate and need to form pollen tube and the rest other steps will follow, right. So, now since we have reached to this stage where we have formed a mature pollen grain, now let us see what will happen next. Here it goes. Okay, now one very important thing that we need to discuss over here is, students, that before an anther dehiscence or undergo dehiscence, dehiscence means rupture of the walls of the anther because of what? Because of which the pollen grains, the mature pollen grains will come out, right, and be scattered, will be scattered in the surrounding environment. So, before this dehiscence takes place, I need to discuss two important conditions over here. See, students, if we can categorize all the angiospermic plants present on this earth into two broad categories, right, on the basis of at which stage in them pollen grain will come out of the anther. Yes, listen very carefully. See here. So, what happens, students, in approximately 60% of angiosperms, what happens is, listen, when the pollen grain has reached to a stage where it has one tube cell or vegetative cell, when a pollen grain has one vegetative cell and generative cell, that means a pollen grain is present in a two-celled stage. At this point of time, the anther will undergo dehiscence and pollen grains will be released. So, this happens in 60% of the angiospermic plant. But in remaining 40% of the angiospermic plants, the remaining 40%, what will happen? So, before the dehiscence of anther, there will be one more additional change that will take place in this pollen grain, and after that change the pollen grain will come out of the anther, that means anther will undergo dehiscence. So, what is that exact one change that will take place that separates this category from this one? So, listen very carefully. So, what happens, students, in these 40% angiospermic plant before the dehiscence of anther, what will happen? this generative cell will undergo mitosis. And why mitosis? Because not to forget, pollen grains are formed from microspores which are haploid in nature. That means both the two cells of nucleus of both the two cells, that is vegetative cell and generative cell, will be haploid, and haploid cell can divide via mitosis only, right. So, generative cell will undergo mitosis to form two male gametes, 1 and 2, that you can see. So, what are these? These are male gametes. So, in 40% angiosperm, before the anther undergo dehiscence, this generative cell will undergo mitosis to form two male gametes. So, this is what? This is a pollen grain with 3-celled stage. So, inside this pollen grain, there is one tube cell also known as vegetative cell and two male gametes. So, this is 3-celled stage of a pollen grain. Now, after formation of these 3 cells inside a mature pollen grain, anther will undergo dehiscence and pollen grains will be released. So, this happens in 40% of the angiospermic plant. So, the objective of this slide was to help you in understanding those important lines that are given in NCERT, where it says that in 60% of angiospermic plant, pollen grains are released at 2-cell stage, and in remaining the pollen grains will be released at 3-cell stage. I hope now none of you will be confused over those important lines, right. Next is what? Yes. So, now let us discuss some more important interesting facts about pollen grain. See here students, listen carefully. There are many plant species whose pollen grains can cause severe allergies as well as respiratory disorders like asthma, bronchitis, even sometimes chronic respiratory disorders. So, if we talk about the examples of such plant whose pollen grains are allergic, the very famous example that is also mentioned in your NCERT, and hence you need to remember it for your exam, for your NEET exam, and the example is Parthenium, carrot grass. So, see student, this is a beautiful image of Parthenium. Yes, I am calling it beautiful because it looks beautiful, and many of you must have seen this plant growing in the vicinity or the open area surrounding your place, your home. You can see this plant, but maybe most of you don't know the name of this plant. This plant actually has very little leaves, and as well as the flowers are also very small in size, white, little small circular globular type of flowers. So, such plant is quite dangerous because it can cause severe respiratory disorders. So, if any one in your home is an asthmatic patient, has asthma or any other respiratory disorders, so make sure that you remove such plant in the surrounding of your, if they are growing in the surrounding of your home or wherever you stay. Make it a point. Now, after this class, you should know that this is the plant Parthenium, carrot grass, that causes एलर्जीज, पोलन एलर्जीज. ओके, आई होप ये ज़रूर बात आपको याद रहेगी इस क्लास के बाद, एटलीस्ट ये ज़रूर याद रखना, राइट. नेक्स्ट इज इकोनॉमिक इम्पॉर्टेंस ऑफ पोलन ग्रेन. So, see students, pollen grains are actually rich in nutrients, and in recent time people have started consuming pollen grains as a food supplements in form of tablets, in form of syrups, especially in the western countries. And these pollen grains are actually known to increase the efficiency of race horses as well as athletes. So, this gives an economic importance to these pollen grains as well. So, remember, this is also important information mentioned in your NCERT. Let us see what I have to discuss next is pollen viability. Yes, another important concept. See, listen carefully, what is pollen viability? So, pollen viability is actually the time period for which a pollen grain remain viable, right? So that when it lands on the stigma of a pistil, it can germinate and form pollen tube. So, the time period for which the pollen grain retain its viability, retain its ability to germinate while landing on the stigma of a female part. That time period is known as pollen viability. Very important, remember this. Okay, so time period for which pollen grain retain its ability to germinate. Next thing that you need to understand is that this pollen viability is actually highly variable, right? It depends upon prevailing temperature and humidity in the surrounding environment in which that particular plant is growing. I hope this much is clear. And NCERT has given some very important examples, and there are high chances of being asked that in members of Rosaceae, Leguminosae and Solanaceae plants, right? What are these? These are families. So, members of these families, in them the pollen grain can retain or maintain its viability for months. But when we talk about rice and wheat, the pollen viability, the time period is just 30 minutes. So, after the release of pollen grain, after 30 minutes of release of the pollen grain, it will lose its viability. It won't be able to germinate and form pollen tube or do rest other processes that are required, right? I hope this is clear. Now, let us see what I have next. Yes, what is pollen bank? See students, pollen banks are such places where pollen grains are stored in liquid nitrogen at -196 °C, right? And what is the purpose of doing all such things? Because not to forget, in the previous slide I explained you about pollen viability. So, if you want to use pollen grain in plant breeding program, you got to store them, right? But storage is not so easy because pollen viability is highly variable and depends upon the prevailing temperature and humidity. So, it is very important to preserve them in the perfect environment in which the pollen viability is not disturbed of that particular pollen of a particular plant species. Only then you can successfully use them in your plant breeding program. So, this is what I wanted to explain in today's session about pollen grain. I really hope you all enjoyed today's session with me, students. Thank you for staying connected. If you like me and my session, give me a thumbs up and do not forget to subscribe Infinity Learn by Sri Chaitanya. Thank you.